Welcome to this, the third in our series of conversations that are part of Zuplo's OpenAPI Week. We're running a week of recorded interviews with celebrities and luminaries and influencers from the API universe to celebrate Zuplo going OpenAPI native. What that means is, as a gateway, as an API management platform, the way you configure Zuplo's routes is actually using an OpenAPI file. So it makes it very, very easy to fit into your workflow and design first and all of these other topics we've been talking about. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by Kevin Swiber, who will introduce himself in a second, but is very well known in the API landscape and involved in OpenAPI, as he'll describe in a second. Hey, Kevin, thanks for coming along today.
Hey, Josh, thanks for inviting me.
No worries. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think it'd be awesome if you could just give folks a little bit of background on yourself, your role, what you do in the day, and what you do with OpenAPI.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've been in kind of the API space for about 15 years now, give or take. And right now I work for Postman. So we build an API lifecycle management platform. And my day-to-day is having conversations with customers about API strategy.
Oh, well, that's awesome. So hopefully we're going to get into that a little bit later in the discussion today, like in some depth, actually. I think picking your brains on how to make this stuff real is going to be great. And I know you're involved in OpenAPI itself as well. What's your role there?
Yeah, so I work closely with our outreach committee that aims to kind of bring community together around OpenAPI, and reach out to various companies, figure out what they're doing with OpenAPI. Right now, we're trying to collect stories and post those on our blog of success stories around OpenAPI.
Awesome. One of the things, with you being a veteran of the API space, you mentioned sort of 15 years you've been involved, looked to you as a little bit of a historian to what I'm going to call the spec wars here. And both Daryl and Phil in our previous conversations mentioned some of the other standards, and we just wanted to explore those a little bit with you and go through them and, maybe some of the other upcoming ones, and, why you think some won out and others are sort of perhaps fading in popularity. I think it'd be great to get into that. So I guess start with your favorite specification other than OpenAPI, obviously. What's what's the most obvious one you'd talk about first?
Yeah, so my favorite was always, and I would say it's, I still prefer it in a lot of ways. It was API Blueprint. It was made by folks at a company called Apiary that have since been acquired by Oracle. Mm-hmm. But it was Markdown based. So it read like documentation. And one of the cool things that it would do is you would form lists with like certain annotations, and it would pull that out as schema for your requests and for your responses, headers, things like that. They had a little format called MSON, like JSON, but with an M, because it was in Markdown. And that was, it was highly effective in getting sort of rich documentation out there. If we look at like OpenAPI, for instance, today, we often see that there is very little documentation associated with different operations, mostly because I think it's difficult to kind of take a narrative and put it into a field inside YAML. So API Blueprint really flipped it on its head and said that this is a more sort of literate config format. It's in Markdown, it's in documentation first, and from that we extract schema.
Oh, interesting. So the reason it's sort of your go-to alternative here is because of that ease of writing and ease of reading as a human looking at the file.
Yeah, and because it was Markdown, it was processable as well through different tools. So you could still like pull out and generate HTML-based documentation off of it. But the authoring experience was very much like documentation, right? Like when I write blog posts today, they're typically in Markdown. And so it's nice. Markdown is such a good format just for kind of getting your thoughts out with some basic formatting, right?
Yeah.
And so it really brought that experience to API documentation.
That's awesome. Yeah. And why do you think, I'll be honest, if I'm being transparent, I don't bump into it much these days. The only time I hear about API Blueprint is when I talk to folks like yourself, and we're kind of reminiscing, if I'm being honest. What's the state of that project? Why do you think it's not as popular today?
Yeah, well, it's still around. I think for a lot of formats out there over the last 10 years or so, they've been tied kind of specifically to vendors, even though the work around the actual format was in the open. They were still, kind of tied to vendors who were supporting those projects and then building tools around those projects. So Apiary, being the company who was doing API Blueprint, had world-class support for API Blueprint and their tools. And now again, that's been acquired by Oracle. So as an Oracle product, we'll see API Blueprint sometimes out there, but typically these are folks who are using Apiary at Oracle.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And it leads me in my mind to think what you're going to say about why OpenAPI perhaps won, but we'll save that. We'll save that moment. What's your next go-to on the list of specs in the spec wars?
Oh, I wasn't a huge fan of most of them, tell you the truth. I think I would probably have gone to RAML afterwards. I think, RAML really looked at what Swagger at the time, before it was OpenAPI, what Swagger was doing, and said, well, we have some other concerns here. Like we want to do like kind of mix-ins and just sort of, we want more flexibility in how we model our APIs. And so RAML came out with, a bunch of different methods for having more flexibility in how that definition was written and composed. And the MuleSoft folks were doing that. Kind of a similar story there. We don't see RAML much anymore, except for MuleSoft customers.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And then I think when it comes to naming of some of these things, I got to give my tip of my hat to like API Blueprint. Like it's kind of obvious what it does, whereas we have all these strange names. I was just chatting with Daryl earlier. We had CADL, which is, I think, is now TypeSpec, Waddle, WSDL, RAML, Swagger. Pretty bizarre naming. What is there any others that you'd think of? RAML and API Blueprint are perhaps the top two I do hear of, even as they don't come up as often these days as they used to. Any other ones of note?
Yeah, I think kind of post-spec wars, you mentioned TypeSpec, formerly known as CADL. I think post-spec wars, we're seeing more languages emerge that sometimes, transpile down to OpenAPI or other formats. TypeSpec is one of them. I really like that. It feels like you're editing a language, whereas like API Blueprint really focused on the documentation. Something like TypeSpec is really focusing on the modeling aspects of it. And how do we get clean modeling out of this and reusable models? So I think there's a lot of benefit there. AWS has a project called Smithy that is kind of looking to do something similar. So I think it's interesting to see, are we headed to a new war on higher level languages that then transpile down to OpenAPI.
So on the note of OpenAPI, then why do you think it's the current front runner? I mean, we just hear about it so often. Obviously, we've leaned into it really heavily in Zuplo by making it the gateway native. Why do you think it won out?
Well, historically, Swagger, before it was called OpenAPI, it was called Swagger. And Swagger had a lot of developer market share. It was really kind of the first format out there that tried to bridge the gap between the reading and the writing experience for API definitions. Prior to this, you mentioned Waddle. Waddle was an extension or heavily inspired by WSDL, which was used in SOAP. And these are really XML heavy kind of languages. And as XML was falling out of favor and JSON was becoming more popular, we saw lots of people just not adapt to Waddle. It came out during this time where folks were transitioning away from XML based formats. So it really didn't even have a chance. And what really took its place was Swagger. And why it had such a big developer market share is because a huge focus wasn't on the format itself, but on what the format could do. So code generation was an early use case used with Swagger. And so if people
code generation, just to pick on that a second, is that SDKs or is it scaffolding out the back end or both? What does code generation mean there?
I believe it started with SDKs and then started moving into things like server stubs
Cool.
for your code. Yeah. So, because it had so much market share, when it came time that like this area was big enough to start standardizing, a lot of folks just came together around Swagger. Swagger ended up selling that name and the open source tools to another vendor, and the specification for Swagger itself became OpenAPI specification. So now we have the OpenAPI initiative, which is a Linux Foundation project that helps manage the governance and the innovation around the OpenAPI specification format itself.
So it sounds like, if I paraphrase, then you think it's the winner because it had this like head start in terms of developer adoption as Swagger, and then now it's transitioned. It's in the Linux Foundation. It's probably the one with the most community led, unless led by a specific vendor like MuleSoft or Apiary, and therefore it's the most, you could argue the most open, I guess. Is that fair?
Yeah, and even these vendors, they started, kind of coalescing around OpenAPI because they would make tools that used API definitions for one reason or another, and they're constantly hitting the friction of people wanting OpenAPI support as well. And so it wasn't long before Apiary product supported both API Blueprint and OpenAPI. And same with MuleSoft. Like eventually they would go to support OpenAPI. And all of these folks really came together when the OpenAPI initiative started, and just said, okay, like we're just going to agree that this is a format that's worthwhile and worth our time to push forward. So.
Yeah, it makes sense. So it kind of hit a critical mass, I guess, where it's just like you kind of got to support this one way or another. Whether it's sort of in gateway land, most people have an import, and we've decided to go fully native. Awesome. That's cool. Yeah, some good history to look back at there. The next thing I'd like to talk about is your day-to-day role and this role you play in helping people build API strategies. You have a fascinating job title there at Postman. I think, help me if I get this wrong, API Lifecycle Integration Specialist, I think is the title.
Yeah, it was really going for the most syllables in a title at the company, and I think
did quite well. Yeah.
Because I've been in this space for so long, and I've done things like I've been on the software engineering is my background, and then architecture, enterprise architecture. But I've been in kind of like API startup land for 10 years now. And so I jump around to all sorts of things, right? Product management, sales, all sorts of things that kind of bridge this gap and allow me to consult on a strategy level when it comes to API strategy within organizations. So that's primarily my role right now. There's a bunch of things I do, like the OpenAPI initiative, but primarily my day-to-day is having conversations with large organizations, sometimes smaller organizations, about the current challenges they're facing in the API space and what they can do to help mitigate some of the issues.
So I'd love to get into some examples of those, obviously generically, and particularly how OpenAPI plays a role in those conversations. I don't know if you've got some that come to mind about what the sort of things you're working on, the problems you're helping people solve, and then how OpenAPI plays a role in that discussion.
Yeah, so we're really going through like this enterprise IT climate shift that's happening right now. When I really started in the API space, I worked for a gateway company called Apigee. And at the time, we were going to, our customers and our prospective customers and convincing them that they had to start investing in APIs because it was important for their business. You fast forward to today, 10 years later, a little more than 10 years now, and we're in a completely different position, right? Enterprise IT has so many APIs, they don't know what to do with them. We've had a lot of changes to how we even structure teams in that 10 years, right? We've moved to models where we have stream-aligned teams that are working more independently. There's less oversight. There's less sort of like governance at the top kind of model. And over time, what's happened is that folks have created a lot of duplication, not only in the APIs that they're building, but their processes. They're solving things like discoverability, distribution in completely different ways. And now the problem of having so many different ways to do the same thing has gotten so large that we're starting to see platform teams emerge. Sometimes these are, they're guided by centers of enablement, centers of excellence, enterprise architecture groups. But there's always some kind of platform play involved. And what these platform teams are doing is they're servicing all of the stream-aligned teams and trying to bring, things like API discoverability and API documentation to some kind of common platform. So it doesn't have to get solved in several different ways. So part of this is kind of handling the API sprawl that we have. I worked with one particular customer who had 7 address verification APIs. When they finally sort of tallied all of the APIs that they have, which, by the way, can be a big job, just trying to find them all, they realized they had 7 of this, right? And this is a totally normal thing. It happens all the time. Unfortunately, some companies just don't have visibility into it. But once you get visibility, then you kind of have to do something about it. So they're looking at, they whittled it down to 3 that they wanted to keep of the 7, by the way, because when you start having all these dependencies, it's hard to get rid of some of them, right?
Sure.
So they whittled it down to 3. But now discoverability is an issue. So, we're looking at things like even internal dev portals are becoming more popular. And typically what's kind of driving like an API catalog entry these days is going to be something like OpenAPI. And one reason that they're going to OpenAPI is because it has so many of these use cases that it can help solve, right? The reasons that OpenAPI was successful to begin with are the reasons why it's continuing to be successful today. We've got, I usually say within like a API consumer experience, you want some kind of consistency. So you're using the same kind of patterns for naming your properties and your paths and things like that. What folks are doing, and you probably talked about this with Phil, is they're using OpenAPI to define those APIs, and then they're doing linting on top of those OpenAPI definitions to check, like, do my resources have plurals in the paths? Am I making sure that I'm not keeping a version in the path? Am I using the right sort of properties inside of my JSON schema? All sorts of things that they're checking for that consistency on. And they're able to do that at, commit time through CI pipelines and things like that. So again, kind of all these use cases from OpenAPI is allowing it to be a vehicle for standardization in a world that is dealing with tons of API sprawl.
Yeah, this is a picture that keeps building now. The more of these conversations I have, where I call it the OpenAPI Wheel of Fortune. I don't know if that's a good name or not, where you have this sort of circle spinning wheel and OpenAPI is at the middle. And then there's all these segments that are all the things you can do with this thing. So, from mocking to linting, like you just described, to documentation generation, to validation of what your actual API is doing, and is it honoring OpenAPI, to enforcement. In a gateway like ours, we can enforce the schema that's incoming is actually matching what's inside your OpenAPI. And it does seem, people come in for different reasons. Like the first segment that goes green is probably mostly documentation. I find in my experience that's how people get started. But maybe it's SDK generation. But that people get much more value out of OpenAPI the more of those segments they go green on. If you add linting to help with your sort of automated governance. What else do you find? These larger customers you're working with. What other segments on the API Wheel of Fortune are they finding most impactful?
So definitely the sort of design time governance that you can do with linting. Documentation is huge. Using it to do things like generate actionable like Postman collections where you can go, start actually executing against that API and getting responses. All sorts of things. And I think what's helping them in these initiatives is if they're in an industry that has API standards that they need to adopt. A lot of these standards have OpenAPI now as well. Most recently, looking at the banking industry architecture network beyond, they have a set of standards now, a lot of them, and they have OpenAPI files for all of them, right? So it acts as a leverage point for a lot of these companies in terms of onboarding, in terms of distribution, really just every kind of phase of the life cycle. We're seeing OpenAPI have an impact.
That's awesome. I'd love to drill into that a little bit. So when you said about this example of one of the banking standards you mentioned there, and they have an open API for that, does that, I think of an open API defining an API like fairly strictly, like these are the paths. So they have a definition of an API that people implement to meet that standard, essentially. And so it's almost like a contract, essentially, that someone wants to implement, I don't know, like Bax or something as a banking payment method. They could basically find the Bax open API document, implement that, and as long as they're good, there's probably some workflow rules as well that are, the order of operation and so on. But at least in terms of a contract perspective, they know exactly how to create the API.
Yep, exactly that. And even contract testing is becoming a much bigger topic these days among companies as well. So, now that we have our paths and our schemas laid out, can we make sure that our server is actually adhering to that? And so, that ends up being a decent use case for these industry standards that are out there that have OpenAPI as well. Like, can I pull that in and make this something I can execute tests against to make sure that we're compliant? We see consumer-driven contract testing helping as well, or starting to come in, where the consumer says, these are the calls that I'm making, and here it is modeled in OpenAPI. Does this match what we have on the server side, right? And really using OpenAPI as a place of collaboration, right? If we want to start collaborating early between producers and consumers at a design phase, we can start with an OpenAPI definition without having built out any servers, right? We can do things like stand up mock servers on top of that, give consumers something to interact with, and say, hey, like we talked about the design, here it is like on a server, go interact with that. And does that meet your expectations, or are we finding anything else that we need to add? There's like old IBM research that talks about the costs of bugs through the life cycle, and how much more expensive it is to hit them in production than it is to hit them in design. And so people are kind of using this as a way to iterate faster, to collaborate better, and to prevent expensive bugs from actually making it to production.
Interesting. So I think you lay out a great case for the power and usefulness of applying OpenAPI. Do you find a lot of resistance in some places to adopt this? Like, what are the obstacles to folks like leaning into some of these concepts like design first and contract testing? And how do you help people get over them? Is the case you just made to us enough, or is there other tricks? If someone's listening here and they're excited about this, what would you say to them about how to go and get their organization or their team to start using this stuff?
Yeah, so, we definitely see less resistance at kind of the architecture level, at the platform level, and more resistance when we get down to kind of the individual teams and the development teams who are doing it, right? It requires a almost cultural shift to start thinking about the design first, and to start with the design document. And so where most people are today is, we'll always have legacy software that, hasn't adopted the latest initiative that we have. It's just sort of the flow of things. So most people, they've got API servers. If they don't have OpenAPI associated with it, they're using tools to generate OpenAPI off of the code. And so they have kind of a code first approach to their APIs as opposed to a design first approach. But there's still benefit in saying, I've got this server here, let me generate OpenAPI on the end of it. Working with customers even recently who are doing this code first approach, but they want to start detecting breaking changes. So an easy way for them to do that is to just generate OpenAPI off of their server, and then run contract tests using the previous version of that OpenAPI from the previous release, and executing those tests against the current version that they're trying to release, right? So they'll be able to take the schema and the format and the model that they used for their API in their last release, execute that against what they're building today, and they're able to see, like, are my clients going to break? It's kind of a backwards way to think about contract testing, right? It's not really doing design first and agreeing to that design and then making sure that the implementation meets the design. But it's using OpenAPI to detect breaking changes between releases on the producer side.
I mean, that sounds super valuable, and I think something IC engineers and so on would see a lot of value in as well. It's the sort of thing nobody wants to break anybody. So yeah, I see that being extremely useful. Just as a sort of closing note, then roughly how many, you have a lot of customer conversations, obviously it's a big part of your job. What percentage of conversations does OpenAPI feature? It plays some role, just as a rough percent?
Like by role or?
By organization, I would say, by company, whether it's small, large, or
almost 100% of my conversations have something to do with OpenAPI these days.
Yeah, I kind of had a feeling that would be the answer. Yeah, I feel like that's our experience now. As I was familiar with this standard from when I worked on Azure API management at Microsoft, and there was still a lot of competition at that point. RAML and Blueprint fighting it out, and it was still called Swagger. And so we didn't lean in as much as we are doing now to OpenAPI, but we added an import OpenAPI button, and so everybody pressed it. Pretty much everybody who came in had an OpenAPI file they were going to import, and hence has driven our decision to really fully lean in. That's awesome, Kevin. This has been great. I think there's a lot of juicy info, particularly in that second half, talking about your role there. And the API lifecycle and how OpenAPI plays an important role in that strategy. Thank you for taking the time for chatting with us. Tomorrow we'll have Eric Wild talking about problem details for HTTP APIs, which is a little bit outside of the OpenAPI remit, but I think is very relevant for people interested in standards and sort of best practices and being able to adopt some guidance quickly to solve some problems. I think it's a good overlap with the rest of the OpenAPI community.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Kevin. Cheers, man. Bye.